Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
On this special edition of Newsmakers, a look at ethics in New Mexico government. Next year, voters will decide whether to create an independent ethics commission. New Mexico is one of only 8 states without a body like this, but critics say there's a lot of work to do before any vote. My guest is Douglas Carver, Executive Director of New Mexico Ethics Watch. Douglas, it's great to have you with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the 2018 public vote on an ethics commission, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your organization. For many people watching, it's probably the first time they've heard of New Mexico Ethics Watch.
And be happy to do so. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, I like to say nonpartisan, bipartisan, because we have a board that's made up of members of both parties and people who aren't politically active and politically engaged. And we've been around for roughly a year, and the idea is to both help educate the people in New Mexico about ethics in the state, and also to assist the authorities in New Mexico in enforcement of the various ethical statutes we have on the books.
Okay, and ethics is such a broad topic. We'll get to a lot in a half hour, but we could probably go on longer than a half hour. Tell me about your background and how you became involved in this issue.
Since I was in law school and I went to University of New Mexico School of Law, and while I was there I started clerking with the Judicial Standards Commission, and that's what gave me a taste for this whole field of government ethics and where those boundaries are between ethical behavior versus illegal behavior. And so I got a taste for it, worked at the commission throughout law school, and then a little bit after law school. And then I ended up working at the New Mexico Legislative Council Service. And while I was there, I was involved with a number of drafting areas, criminal justice drafting, but also election law and ethics laws. So I worked on some of the ethics legislation that eventually made its way partway through the legislative process. And I also have done some work on political campaigns involved with legal compliance. So I've come at this issue from a variety of different angles. And also, while at the legislature, I worked on the 2 impeachment committees that were formed by the House, both for Secretary Duran and for Public Regulation Commissioner Block a number of years ago. So I was staffing both of those committees, and I also worked on the Interim Legislative Ethics Committee, which is the legislature's internal ethics body.
So a lot of background on this topic, and
Yes, sir.
It may be surprising to some people, it was surprising to me, that New Mexico is one of just 8 states that does not have an independent ethics commission. Why, in your view, why are these commissions so important?
They're important because they help to focus the public's attention on issues of ethics. I think part of the problem people might have now, and something New Mexico Ethics Watch is helping to ameliorate, is when something happens with people, they're not entirely sure always where to go with the complaint against a public official. And if there is a statewide ethics commission, then there'd be, to be colloquial, one-stop shopping for ethics complaints. That's the goal, that's the idea. And so it'll help focus the state's attention on these matters of ethics and help bring a lot of this disparate jurisdiction about ethics under one roof, which ideally will help with enforcement.
And consistency, I would guess.
And consistency as well.
Okay. I know that one of your major concerns, and I'm grateful to see that there has been recently some press coverage of this, so that there is becoming a little bit of public knowledge about this, is that it appears voters will be asked in 2018 to approve an ethics commission before the legislature designs the powers of the commission.
That's correct. And that was part of what happened in the legislative process. As we all know, bills are introduced. And there's trading that goes on, particularly with constitutional provisions. The legislature takes them very seriously. And there is a matter of debate amongst legislators as to how much detail should or should not be in a constitutional provision. In our state, traditionally, we don't have a lot of detail, not exclusively. So a lot of the provisions that were in the initial proposal that was introduced by Representative Jim Dines were stripped out to be as provided by law. And what that means in layman's term is that there's certain powers in the commission, but the details of those powers will be filled in later. So we don't know what the commission is going to look like outside of its membership. That is fixed in the constitutional provision that will be on the ballot, but everything else, those details are to be filled in later.
And, you know, I think that a lot of people would have concerns about that, not just you and your organization, because we're asking citizens then to vote on something that is not really complete.
That's correct. And that's, we're happy that we seem to have struck a nerve in pushing for what's called the enabling legislation. Again, that's the technical term for the statutes that bring a constitutional provision to life. And we've been asking that the legislature use the opportunity it has in these 2 interim periods before the vote to produce a draft of enabling legislation. Now, the legislature has gone both ways with constitutional provisions. Sometimes they've crafted the enabling legislation before a vote, and the statutes go into effect, presuming the measure passes, and sometimes they do it afterwards. And they've gone both ways in recent years. We are hoping the legislature will avail themselves of the opportunity to at least give us a draft of the legislation before the vote in November 2018.
And let's get to some of the specifics. You have very specific requirements that you have been very open about. You have this on your website, and you say that this should be grounded in the state constitution. That's the first thing. Explain for me why that is so important.
That's critical to protect the commission itself. It's far more difficult to change the Constitution than it is to change a statute. And the classic example that everyone uses in discussing this issue is what happened in Wisconsin. They had what was considered the model ethics commission in the nation. Law review articles were written about it. People designing commissions said, look at Wisconsin. And then the commission got crosswise with the governor of Wisconsin and the legislature in Wisconsin, and they essentially blew up their commission. They divided it up, changed its powers, limited its scope and jurisdiction, and that's what can happen to a commission that's not grounded in the Constitution.
So politics gets involved.
Because it's a tough thing to do, and you're asking legislators and when the governor signs a statute, a governor, to create a supervising authority over them, and that makes people nervous.
Absolutely. Well, you also say, and this gets to, really it ties into the constitutional requirement, that the Ethics Commission should be independent of influence from any one branch of government. Explain how this can be accomplished.
It can be accomplished by having a balanced membership on the commission.
Okay.
And what's interesting about this commission is all the drafts and discussion have generally been about the legislative and executive branch. We have a very good, in fact, a model judicial standards commission in this state. It's considered one of the top judicial misconduct commissions nationwide. It's one of the things New Mexico does very well on ethics, arguably the only thing. Ideally, a commission would have a membership that was well balanced between the legislative and the executive. There was a late change to this constitutional provision where the balance of membership shifted. It's a 7-member commission as drafted. Initially, 4 members were appointed from various authorities in the legislature, and 3 were appointed by the governor. The late change was that 4 were appointed by the legislature, 1 by the governor, and the remaining 2 members are appointed by those 4 legislative members. So that's a concern, and it's one of the reasons, again, we're asking the legislature to take the opportunity of producing a draft of the enabling statutes before we vote, since power has shifted towards the legislative branch in the constitutional makeup of the commission.
Yeah. that is. That would be very much, enormous power with one branch of government.
Precisely.
Okay. You say another principle here is that an independent ethics commission should have enforcement power, and this should include independent subpoena powers and the ability to initiate an investigation without a complaint. Explain the importance of those things.
The importance of those is that we want the commission to be able to act without being asked to act. And there are instances nationwide and with various types of ethics commissions in certain localities that say we can't act until a complaint is brought before you. So for instance, something might blow up in the headlines of the newspaper, but if no one bothers to file a complaint, then in those cases a commission's hands would be tied.
Right.
Versus our Judicial Standards Commission, which can initiate its own investigation. So if you have a judge involved in misconduct on the front page of the paper, they can open a file that day and start investigating. The subpoena power is important because you need a commission at the investigatory stage to be able to get documents, to summon witnesses if necessary, to have a legal sledgehammer, as it were, to get people to talk and to get evidence so they can compile a case and build a case, or exonerate someone. They can look at the documents and say this was just a frivolous complaint, or it's sour grapes or something like that. But they need to be able to thoroughly investigate a situation that comes to their attention, and they can't do that without a subpoena power, particularly at the investigatory stage.
And when I was looking at these requirements, it was so interesting to me because particularly this notion of this commission being able to initiate something without a complaint. The scenario that you explained, it would seem as if, well, is that really all that important? Because if something gets out into the public, we would think that someone would file an official complaint. Right. But we've seen at the federal level with President Trump, there have been many informal inquiries and complaints, but it's taking independent groups to actually file lawsuits to get a decision on many of these really important ethical questions as to what the president can and cannot do, and those who report to him what they can and cannot do.
And the federal example is a great example because there is something called the Office of Government Ethics, and their recommendations and the advice of their counsel is generally followed by presidents. But as we're learning, they have no enforcement authority whatsoever. So they can say X looks bad, X looks wrong, but it's dependent on outside forces to do something. And so that's why we need a commission to have its own enforcement authority, and to have some kind of sanction or some kind of ability to penalize our state officials. So it's not just a toothless commission and they're just waving a flag saying this is bad, but nothing can happen.
Yeah, okay. Another principle you talk about is transparency, especially regarding complaints, and that this transparency should include regular reporting on the activities of the commission. We've all been witness to major controversies at the state and federal level where it seems as if there's an endless study of something. It goes on for years and years, and you don't get regular updates on what's going on. Is progress being made? And that could be really problematic.
Exactly. And we've all seen over years in the state, through administration after administration, that news might pop up of an investigation of possible misconduct somewhere, or a complaint being filed with a state agency, and then nothing happens. It falls into an abyss. And people forget, other things come up, and sometimes it could be years with no resolution. And so one of the things we're hoping to see in the statutes is that there's some sort of timetable or mechanism under which complaints have to be processed. And the transparency piece is important as well, because it's important to have maximal transparency. So we know what complaints have been filed and how a commission, were to be created, is handling those. How many complaints are coming in? How quickly are they turning them around? How many are they dismissing? And what's happening to them along the way?
Unlike some issues, the good news with this is, as we pointed out earlier in the program, there is somewhat of a blueprint because there are only 8 states, including New Mexico, that don't have an independent ethics commission. So we can theoretically learn best practices by looking at how other states are operating, what problems have they run into.
Exactly.
In investigating this, has anything stood out to you at all?
Well, a couple points to that. Mm-hmm. One is this is why we're encouraging the interim committee process to be utilized. And the Courts, Corrections, and Justice Interim Committee, it's a committee on which I served as lead staff for a few years, is a natural venue for this, and they've said they're going to put it on their interim agenda because experts can come before that committee and bring examples and say these are best practices, this is what has worked, what hasn't worked. But we don't have to go that far, we don't even have to look afield because we have our state's Judicial Standards Commission, which has been working quite well in recent years. It was pretty quiet for a number of years, but then starting in kind of the early 2000s, it shifted gears. And we can see what the strengths of that commission are, and part of it's openness, it's a number of competing authorities looking at judges. Some of the weaknesses, which are that confidentiality ceases quite late in the process, and that's a great weakness for our Judicial Standards Commission is we're an outlier state and how late that confidentiality ends. And we can draw from that example. We have a homegrown example of how an ethics commission can work and function effectively because the commission, I think everyone would agree, helped to change the culture of the judiciary in the state for the better in the recent decade.
Following up on another point, you note that the process in terms of looking at complaints must be done in a timely fashion. How difficult is it to set parameters on this? Because of course, every case is different. Some cases would be very complicated, I imagine.
That's an excellent question, and I've been involved in this very question from a legislative drafting point of view and trying to work the language about how to work that. And something we can look at, it's a little bit controversial in the Albuquerque area, but this case management order that came down for a judicial district from the court where the Supreme Court says you guys have to speed up the process. So we can put rules into effect, and that would be a great area of debate with the legislature about how much of the, how fast, what kind of timetable should they put in, do they need to put in. There obviously would have to be exceptions for a case. I think the real critical factor is when the complaints come in, how long the respondent to a complaint has to respond and when confidentiality ceases. Because then people can see that the process has started. And to have those clearly spelled out in the enabling statutes is critical. And it's an important debate and one that shouldn't be left to the heat of a legislative session. It should be thoroughly discussed over the next 2 summers.
Okay. Well, and we'll be, I'm sure, talking with you about this again as we get closer to a vote next year. Beyond an ethics commission, what do you see right now, Douglas, as important ethical challenges for New Mexico government?
I'd say the main challenge is what has been termed the enforcement gap in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And this is the Center for Public Integrity did a report a couple of years ago, and every state was ranked on ethics, and we got a low grade. Our Judicial Standards Commission inflated our grade, but the report focused on what was termed the enforcement gap in New Mexico. We actually, even now, have pretty good laws on the books that our Secretary of State and Attorney General can enforce, but the problem is no one's enforcing them. No one's policing them, and that's something we found in the research for our first report, which we published in January on the Financial Disclosure Act, that prior Secretary of States, and we did the research before the current Secretary took office, hadn't even been looking, we could tell, at the financial disclosure forms that were being filed. We were finding ones unsigned, finding ones with inadequate information. So we had this pretty loophole-ridden minimal standard Financial Disclosure Act, but no one was even doing the basics when the forms came in to make sure the forms were properly submitted.
And what did you find when you looked into that? Are we dealing with an issue of money, of having enough employees to review the forms? Or is it simply
the
management of the department,
I
or
think
a
it's-
combination?
I think it's all of the above.
Okay.
And one thing the new secretary did is it was one of the many areas that she instituted new and better protocols to change that. And the secretary has just discussed that she's publishing rules for the first time on some of the campaign finance regulations. And she said she's going to publish rules on the Financial Disclosure Act. So there is a question of management, but the Secretary of State's office is underfunded and overburdened. And that's the first line of defense for many of these governmental conduct type statutes. Is the first line of enforcement is the Secretary's office, and that office has just not been supported financially as needs to be done.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing that is different from so many other states is that while we have interim committees, we do not have the legislature meeting to make decisions for very long periods. It is,
Right.
of course, to remind our viewers, 1 month and then 2 months in the other years. So it's not a whole lot of time, and they're volunteers. They are not paid a salary. So it is difficult. It is not a full-time job. How much of an impediment do you see this being in getting the details of this written, this Ethics Commission written, before the vote next year?
Well, this is where the public needs to be aware, and your
Okay.
viewers and listeners need to be aware of this interim committee process. And something that interested me first when I was a legislator, and now that I'm working for a public interest nonprofit, is how few people in the state, even people who are very politically aware, know that interim committees exist and know what they do. The legislature, which means us, the taxpayers, spend thousands and thousands of dollars on per diem and mileage for legislators to attend these committees. And they meet generally monthly, and they discuss legislation that might come before the legislature. They also, there's about 23, 25 of these committees. The number shifts a bit every year. They'll get experts come in and inform them about the area of expertise for the committee. And like I said, the ethics legislation always goes through the Courts, Corrections, and Justice Interim Committee. And the committees will often, at the end of an interim period, endorse legislation. And that's usually a unanimous bipartisan vote. And the committees are all bicameral and bipartisan, so they have House and Senate members. And they will say, yes, we all agree that this is a good piece of legislation to introduce. They'll say endorsed by Courts, Corrections, and Justice, and be introduced into the legislative session in that way. And it's a good way to vet legislation, vet ideas, have people air ideas. And so we are arguing that there's a golden opportunity over this summer and next summer. The interim
So there's
committee-
enough time. It
there's
really
plenty of
shouldn't
time.
be a problem.
It's summer and autumn every year.
How much of an impediment, though, is it that even though we have these interim committees, there isn't the press coverage and public attention on them as there is when the legislative session occurs? So while there may be a debate among legislators, there really isn't some would argue, a public debate.
Yes. I think that's a huge impediment, and that's
Okay.
part of
why you're
why
here
I'm
today.
here today. That's precisely actually one of the things I want to talk about. And there's a number of groups in the state that are talking about this opportunity that's presented to inform people about the interim process. I can guarantee you lobbyists know about it. Advocates who do this day in, day out know about it, because I've worked on a number of these committees and I see who comes regularly. And so it's important that the public knows. These are all public meetings. They meet in various locales around the state. Their schedules are all put up on the legislative website. And so it's important, and part of what we're doing is informing people that these exist.
This is going on.
It should be on the agenda, and when it's on the agenda, if you're interested in this issue, you can get in touch. You can attend the meeting, and failing that, you can get in touch with any of the legislators on that committee and say, this is important to me, please discuss it. And if there's enough public interest, the press might and can and has in the past reported on what comes out of the interim committee. And so we're hoping, and there's others working along the same lines, to generate enough interest that people will actually focus on what the interim committee is doing on this issue.
We're quickly running out of time, and I wanted to make sure to ask you about an ethical issue that has come up in New Mexico. It's come up elsewhere, and it's, I think, a very important one. time limits before legislators or cabinet appointees can work for organizations that lobby our state government. As you know, this is not an uncommon question. Recently, we had the former Environment Secretary for Governor Martinez take a job as the head of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. What are your thoughts on this issue?
We should do what we can to prevent it as best we can. And even at the federal level, they do this. There was a bill introduced in the last session to have a 2-year ban, so basically a 2-year wait before you could walk through the revolving door. That got watered down during the session to 1 year with some pretty big loopholes written into it, and then it died on the Senate floor.
And people would probably be surprised to hear that because it didn't get much attention.
No,
and it is a very difficult problem because even if you write a ban in, if the ban is written so to say you cannot be a lobbyist, that would not prevent someone technically from running an organization that hires lobbyists.
Right.
So the law has to be very carefully written.
The law has to be carefully written. It comes into play with the Ethics Commission. One of the provisions stripped out was a ban on who could serve on the commission. So the current appointment powers are in the Constitution. What we are waiting to see in the enabling legislation is whether there'll be any restrictions on who may serve on the commission if you've been a lobbyist or a legislator or a politician in the previous number of years. But this revolving door legislation, like all ethics legislation, has to be drawn carefully so you're not capturing too many people and you're not opening too many loopholes to make the law toothless or pointless.
And this really is important, isn't it, Douglas? Because we're not just talking about just the real conflicts of interest or the real problems that sometimes occur because of this, but we're talking about our faith in government.
Precisely.
Whether people really believe that folks are doing public service or whether they're just setting themselves up for their next job.
Precisely, and it's largely a matter of perception, and it looks bad. Regardless of the motives or the conflicts that people might have, it looks bad. And that's why New Mexico Ethics Watch has looked at the Financial Disclosure Act, and we'll be looking at the Lobbyist Regulation Act and advocating for better enforcement and laws that provide us more information. Our financial disclosures right now, even if they're filled out perfectly well, tell us very little about whether a public official might have a financial disclosure in the matter that he or she is voting on or deciding upon, because our law is so weak. And it's a lot of ethics is perception, and the perception in the state is that we're in bad shape ethically.
And that can of course lead to many other problems. Some would argue folks just checking out, not even saying, well, why vote? They're all crooks, essentially.
Precisely.
This idea.
And there's also a fair bit of pretty strong academic research to support the idea that less ethical governance leads to worse economic outcomes for communities and states.
Yeah.
And so there's, if you don't want to be all idealistic about it and want to look at the bottom line, better ethics means more money for the state.
And we want people to register to vote. We want people to vote.
Right.
And for many people, especially today, I think you could argue that we need that faith in that there's a process and a fair process.
Precisely.
Thank you for sharing this, and we'll hope to talk again before the vote in 2018.
It was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's Morning Edition 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.